Recently, we concluded 10 weeks of looking at Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And within all of the different areas of conflict and turmoil going on in that church, there are some that to us are very bizarre and strange and have to do with customs and things that are particular to the time period. There are other conflicts, though, that feel a little more contemporary. Throughout it all, though, we find in 1 Corinthians and in those who worshiped there a common human bond and a common spiritual bond with us. Paul's writing here that Howard read for us today recounts the events that we celebrate when we celebrate the Last Supper. You'll notice it's almost identical to the version that is found in what's known as the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Although Paul is writing to the Corinthians before those Gospels were written. So that suggests that both Paul and the Gospel writers may have had either a common written source that they are quoting or a common oral tradition that they are quoting. And the reason Paul is emphasizing this is because he is disturbed with what's happening when they gather to worship and to celebrate the Eucharist. At this time, the Christian church is in its embryonic stages, or at least its theology is. It's just now beginning to come into formation. And they're worshiping in people's homes. They are gathering for a meal, and then they are reading from the Old Testament, singing hymns, either familiar hymns out of the Jewish tradition or new Christian hymns that we're developing. They're praying for one another. They are reading letters and other kinds of writings from apostles and leaders in the Christian church, such as this letter from Paul. And then they are celebrating communion. One of the things that means is when they gather to worship like this, because they were in someone's home, even in a fairly large home, that means there wouldn't have been that many people present. Tonight, there are probably more than double the number of people here than would have worshiped in that Corinthian church and heard this letter read to them. And what Paul is upset about is the church is somewhat diverse in that time period. You have people who are very poor, people who are slaves, who are working as laborers in the field or in the shops all day long. And you also have some people that by our standards are considered an upper middle class, shop owners, tradespeople, someone who might have a larger home and a servant or two who works for him. Those are the kind of people who would have likely housed a worship service like this. And whenever they gathered, those who were wealthier were able to get there first. And they were eating up all of the food, and they were drinking up all of the wine. So that by the time the servants who came in later, not only was there no meal for them to enjoy, but they were left out of the elements of communion, of bread and wine. And that is what is upsetting to Paul. The fact that there are some people who are being left out of this sacred ritual. Now, when it comes to church people, and when it comes to the times when church people hurt one another, normally it's not a case of deliberate, malicious intent. There are some examples of that. Those are extreme dysfunctional churches, and that's a sermon for another day. But normally, when people like you and I do things that are hurtful to one another in church, it's not because we intended to. We're just in our own little world. We're doing our own thing. We're doing what feels natural for us. And as long as it feels natural and comfortable to us, we're not thinking about how that might feel to others. And I am imagining whoever is hosting this service in the church in Corinth, and the wealthier people who got there first, they're just living their life the way they were used to living it. They were sitting down to eat. They're used to being people of some leisure, of people of privilege. They are accustomed to being waited on. They're accustomed in having more than enough food than they needed to be healthy and strong. They're just doing what is natural to them. But Paul is trying to say to them that when you encounter the risen Lord, when you accept his invitation to come to the table and to receive the gifts of bread and the cup, then it opens our eyes and it broadens our perspective. We can no longer live in our own little bubble, but we notice those around us. Especially we notice those who are marginalized, those who are downtrodden, those who need the kind of help that we can give, those who are not in power and in influence. And what Paul is trying to say to the Corinthians is that when you gather to celebrate the Lord's Supper, if you are not including everybody, if you are not doing this in a spirit of openness, then you are doing it wrong. A colleague of mine who was a pastor in this conference for many years, who has since passed away, shared a story about a time she went to a new appointment and found that she had an opportunity to help lead worship services in a juvenile detention facility for young men. She talked to a pastor from another church who had been leading services there, and she asked, well, what exactly do you do when you worship with them? And somewhat off the cuff, he said, oh, we normally get together and sing a few hymns out of the hymnal, and then I just read scripture and invite people to give their lives to Jesus. And she said, well, I want to celebrate communion. And so she arrived early for her first worship service so she could go through the screening with the bread and the juice and make sure she wasn't bringing anything she shouldn't. And she took a table and she set it up. And she got a plastic plate that they were able to give her from the cafeteria and a plastic pitcher. And she put the loaf of bread on the paten and she poured the juice into the cup. And whenever the guards began to bring the young inmates into the room, one of the first men to enter stopped and was taken by the table. And he pointed at it and he asked her, is that the body and blood of Christ? And she said, yes, it is. And with tears in the young man's eyes, he said, I never thought I'd see it again. As the Christian church, we are stewards of what God has put into our hands. And one of the most precious and sacred things that has been put into our hands is this sacrament of bread and wine. And it is our responsibility every time we come to this table to celebrate it in a spirit of openness and to make sure that the invitation goes out to all of the world, that this table is available for anyone who wishes to respond to our Lord's invitation or to partake of the gifts of bread and the wine. Amen.